The fifth chapter of Bava, the tractate of damages, is going to close with the pit. The pit is the second archetypal damage causing object. And interestingly, it only has a few Mishnayot that apply to it. The pit, if you like, is a passive cause of danger, unlike the ox, which is some mobile source of danger. The owner needs to take care of it. The pit is a passive source of danger. And we need to think about, well, who is really responsible for guarding the pit? The text says, Velo yichasenu. The text refers to an owner who doesn't cover it up properly. The pit's got to be covered up. It's got to be made safe. And the Mishnah goes on to say, Bor shel shnei shutafim. This pit belonged to two partners. So maybe either one of them was responsible. Avar alav harishon velo chisahu. The first one passed by and he didn't cover it up. Hasheni velo chisahu. The second partner went over it and he didn't cover it up. And it's interesting. At this point, you might think that they are both liable for damage if somebody falls into the pit. You might think they're both liable, but the Mishnah is going to give particular responsibility to the second one. I think in traffic terminology, we talk about the person who had the last clear chance to avoid the accident. The person that has the last chance to avoid the accident has got a particular responsibility. And the Mishnah rules, Hasheni chayav. The second one is liable. The last person to not cover it up is going to be liable. Kisahu karaui v'nafal latocho shor or chamor umeit patur. If he covered it properly and an ox or an ass fell into it and died, he's not liable. So remember, the text says, Velo yichasenu. The text refers to a pit that wasn't covered up. If the owner's taken proper care to cover it up, he's no longer liable. Lo chisahu karaui. If he did not cover it properly, conversely, if he did not cover it properly and an ox or an ass fell into it and died, he's going to be liable. If it fell forward, this is the ox or the ass. The ox or the ass, it's falling forward mikol hakriya, because of the sound of the digging. So we got this ox standing next to a pit, and there's a digging sound. There's a thumping sound coming from inside the pit, and it gives the ox such a shock that it falls forward. Chayav, he's liable for injuries. If you're digging, if you're making a sound that makes an animal fall in your pit, you're going to be liable. Interesting. If it fell backwards because of the sound of the digging, he's not liable. It sounds as though if he's falling backwards, he's falling into the sound. So it must have been something else that made him fall. If you fall backwards into a sound, it sounds as though you've been scared by something on the other side. Well, that's the implication of the Mishnah, anyway, as far as we can see. What about an ox that falls into it with all of its gear on? Because remember, an ox, these are agricultural animals, right? Maybe he's got his yoke or his harness or his straps. He could be carrying burden. He could have all kinds of things on him, on this ox. So an ox and its gear fall into the pit, venish tabru, and they break. There's a fantastic mess at the bottom of this pit when the ox is probably falling on top of all of the gear. Or maybe the ass falls in with its gear and the stuff gets torn. Maybe the reins get torn or the harness gets torn. Chayav ala behema ufatur ala kelim. He's liable for the beast, but not liable for the gear. The text specifically mentions the liability for the animal. It doesn't mention the gear. And we're going to learn from that he's only liable for the animal. Nafal l'tuchoshor cheresh shotive katan chayav. That ox which is deaf or insane or young fell in. This is really interesting. Normally we attribute these categories, deaf, insane, or young, to people, and we say these kind of people, have special status because they're not fully in control of their actions, or maybe they don't have agency. This is the ox, which is cheresh or tivik katan, an ox which is deaf, insane, or young, and it falls in the pot, and the owner of the pit is still liable, chayav, because he still needs to take care that nothing is going to fall in his pit. Ben ovat eved or mapatur, a boy or a girl or a slave or a slave girl falls in, patur, he's not liable. This is very interesting. I will presume, by the way, he's liable for civil damages. I presume he's liable for civil damages. That is something we're going to have to explore offline. But in terms of the specific penalty of an ox or an ass falling in, he's not liable there. But even though we don't include people in this categorization, we do include all other animals. An ox and all other beasts are the same under the laws of falling into a pit. In other words, when the Torah speaks about an ox or an ass, it's not specific to the ox or the ass, or at least this is the innovation that the rabbis are making. This is the generalization that the rabbis are making. They're going to apply this to any kind of animal that falls into the pit, and in fact to other kinds of damages. And not just this, but they're going to apply it to all kinds of other mitzvot. So we're now closing the 5th chapter with a whole list of other mitzvot that mention ox and the ox and the ass. So let's have the list. Ulhafrashat Har Sinai, keeping away from Mount Sinai. This is mentioned in the Parsha of Yitro, so just before the Parsha of Mishpatim, where all of these laws are derived. So we're in Exodus. We're about chapter 20, 21, 22 in Exodus. And all of the laws of damages are learnt from these chapters in Exodus. And this Mishnah seems to jump on a whole bunch of other laws which are mentioned practically in the same place. So chapter 19, Yitro, Moshe is commanded to keep people away from the mountain for 3 days before the Torah is given. And that applies to im behema, im ish, to cattle or to human. Neither cattle or human are allowed to come on the mountain for 3 days before the Torah is given. And we're going to extend that to all other animals. Echad hashor ve'echad kol habehema. An ox and all the other beasts are the same under these laws. So the first one on the list was keeping away from Mount Sinai. Let's keep going. Ula tashlumei chefel, double restitution. If you're guarding something, if you're, let's say you're a custodian and you're negligent in your custody, you have to pay double compensation to the person that put the object into custody for you. And the Torah mentions an ox or an ass, but it actually applies to any animal. Ula hashiv aveda. If you see a wandering ox or animal, a lost ox or ass, you have to return it. And that applies to all animals. It's not just an ox or an ass. Lifrika, to unloading. If you see an ass which is struggling under its load, you have to help its owner unload it. And it's not just an ass. It applies to any beast of burden. La chasima, to muzzling. You can't muzzle the ox that treads the corn. And it doesn't just apply to an ox, it applies to any animal. La kilaim, diverse kinds. We don't mate different kinds of animals together. Ve la Shabbat, and for the Shabbat. So the Shabbat is not just for us and our servants and our children. It's for our cattle as well. The cattle are specifically mentioned in the command to keep Shabbat. There's a story about, I think it's Rabbi Elazar, whose ox went out with some carrying some stuff on its horns, and the sages didn't approve that. Just as we don't go out carrying on Shabbat, the ox doesn't go out carrying on Shabbat, and it applies to any kind of animal. And the rabbis close this chapter of Bava Kama with their generalization from ox and ass to any other possible moving object. Maybe they would generalize to a car today. And they ask, so to wild animals and birds, we're talking totally generally in this case. If so, why is it written an ox or an ass? Why does the Torah speak in terms of an ox or an ass when it applies much more generally, much more widely? And the Mishnah answers, because scripture speaks in the present. Scripture speaks in the present. Really interesting idea. So the text speaks about an ox or an ass because those are the kind of animals they had around in those days. It speaks about conditions which were prevalent at the time. But just because scripture talks about conditions prevalent at the time, it talks about an ox or an ass because they didn't have motor cars in those days. But we can generalize all of these principles much more broadly. Just because scripture speaks about an ox or an ass doesn't prevent us learning much more complex and much more wide-ranging laws of damages from these ideas.